In 1931, at a quiet dinner in Tokyo, a Japanese cavalry officer who had just spent 2 years watching America from the inside leaned across the table and told his colleagues something they did not want to hear. He told them never to fight the United States. He told them the American worker was energetic, versatile, and backed by an industrial potential that was, in his exact word, fabulous. His colleagues smiled politely and went back to their sake. 14 years later, that same officer would be buried somewhere under the black sand of Iwo Jima, and the men who had dismissed him would be signing surrender documents on the deck of a battleship. His name was Tadamichi Koribayashi, and he had tried to warn them. The warning was ignored because it could not be believed. Not in 1931, not in 1937, not even on the morning of December 7th, 1941, when the Imperial Japanese Navy struck Pearl Harbor and, for a few intoxicating months, seemed to have proven Kuribayashi wrong. In those first months, the Japanese High Command walked through the Pacific like men walking through a door that had been left open for them. Manila fell, Singapore fell, the Dutch East Indies fell, Wake Island fell. The British surrendered 80,000 men in a single afternoon at Singapore. The Americans surrendered the Philippines and left 78,000 men to die on the roads of Bataan. By May of 1942, Imperial Japan controlled more territory than any Asian power had ever controlled in recorded history. And the men who ran that empire believed they had discovered a law of nature. The law was simple. The Western soldier was soft. He fought for wages and comfort. He was a product of shopkeepers and factory workers and people who drank milk out of bottles. The Japanese soldier, by contrast, fought for the emperor and for a spiritual principle older than the steel in his rifle. Bushido, the way of the warrior. The way that taught that death in combat was beautiful and surrender was worse than death. This was not private opinion, it was doctrine. On January 7, 1941, War Minister Hideki Tojo had put his name to a small book called the Senjinkun, the Field Service Code, and ordered that every soldier in the Imperial Japanese Army carry it. The book forbade surrender. Not discouraged, forbade. A captured Japanese soldier was, by official definition, already dead. The body simply had not caught up with the paperwork. And because the Senjinkun shaped how Japanese soldiers thought about themselves, it also shaped how they thought about their enemies. When Japanese intelligence officers studied the United States Marine Corps and saw units that used artillery before they used bayonets, units that withdrew when they were outflanked, units that counted their casualties and tried to keep them low, they did not see professionalism. They saw cowardice. They saw confirmation. The United States Marine Corps in 1942 was small, about 70,000 men at the start of the year. The Japanese Army had more soldiers in China than that. The Marines had no combat experience worth the name since the Banana Wars. They were considered, by serious analysts in Tokyo, a ceremonial force, the naval infantry of a country that did not take land warfare seriously. This was the assessment that would meet the 1st Marine Division on a narrow sandbar on the island of Guadalcanal on the night of August 20th, 1942. The Marines were waiting. The assessment was about to be tested against a river, a machine gun, and a colonel named Ichiki who had brought a sword. In 1931, at a dinner in Tokyo, Kuribayashi had warned his colleagues. In August of 1942, on a different night, a different Japanese colonel sat in a different room and made a different calculation. Colonel Colonel Ichiki was not a reckless man. He was a veteran. He had been part of the planning for the Midway operation only weeks before, and he had watched 4 Japanese aircraft carriers burn in a single afternoon at the hands of American dive bombers. He had been spared the worst of it only because his regiment, the elite 28th Infantry, had been embarked for the occupation of Midway and then rerouted when the operation collapsed. Ichiki knew the Americans had teeth. He simply believed they did not have the stomach to use them on land. The assignment handed to him on August 16th was to land on Guadalcanal with 917 of his men, march through the jungle, and throw the Marines off the island. The rest of his regiment, some 1,500 additional soldiers, would follow a few days later. Ichiki's orders told him to wait for those reinforcements. Ichiki decided not to. He had his reasons. Every hour spent waiting was an hour the Marines could spend digging in. Every hour was an hour closer to American air power returning to the area. And Ichiki, who had grown up on stories of the Russo-Japanese War, believed what his generation had been taught to believe, that the decisive infantry charge was a law of combat, a thing that worked because it had always worked. On the night of August 20th, Ichiki put his men on the east bank of a shallow stream the Americans called Alligator Creek. Between his regiment and the Marine lines lay a narrow spit of sand perhaps 100 feet wide. Beyond the sand, dug into the coconut grove on the west bank, were the men of Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. They had been alerted hours earlier by a captured Japanese map and a Marine patrol that had ambushed one of Ichiki's scout parties. They had set up their machine guns in enfilade. They had registered their artillery. They had been told what was coming. Ichiki did not know any of this. What he knew was that the Americans were across a sandbar that a determined man could cross in 40 seconds. He drew his sword. At 03:10 hours, he sent his first wave across the sand. The first thing the Marines did was wait. This is the detail that does not appear in the Japanese understanding of the battle, because in the Japanese understanding of the battle, Western soldiers panic. What the Marines actually did was hold their fire until the lead ranks of the 28th Infantry were 50 yards out on open sand. Then, a Marine corporal named Dean Wilson opened up with a Browning automatic rifle. The other machine guns joined in a quarter second later. There is a moment in the recollections of Japanese survivors when the language stops being military and starts being something else. The sandbar became, in their descriptions, a place where the air itself was solid. The lead ranks did not fall, they came apart. The second ranks, advancing behind them, ran directly into the enfilading fire from the Marine flanks and into the registered artillery that began falling 90 seconds after the first machine gun opened. Colonel Ichiki, who was somewhere in the second wave, was hit. How he died is disputed. What is not disputed is that by dawn, roughly 800 of his 917 men were dead on or around the sandbar, and the remaining 100 were fleeing back into the jungle or dying in the surf where Marine tanks had come down to finish them. A Japanese survivor of that night later wrote a sentence that is worth sitting with. He had known Ichiki personally. He had admired him. He had watched his commander walk into the machine guns with a drawn sword and the certainty of a man who believed the universe would bend around his courage. As the survivor later recorded, this episode made it abundantly clear that infantrymen armed with rifles and bayonets had no chance against an enemy equipped with modern heavy arms. This tragedy should have taught us the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics. Should have. Two of the saddest words in the Japanese account of the Pacific War. Because the tragedy of the Tenaru River was only the first tuition payment on a lesson that the Imperial General Headquarters would refuse for 3 more years to actually learn. The document that mattered most was not an operations order. It was the Senjinkun, the small book that Hideki Tojo had issued on January 7th, 1941. And by August of 1942, every man who fought for Japan was carrying a copy inside his own skull. The Senjinkun forbade surrender. That much is usually mentioned. What gets mentioned less is what the Senjinkun did to Japanese military analysis. Because once you have written a doctrine that treats self-preservation as moral failure, you will inevitably read enemy self-preservation the same way. You have no other interpretive tool. And so when Japanese intelligence officers in 1942 looked at U.S. Marine tactics and saw men who broke contact under fire to call in artillery, men who dug foxholes instead of fixing bayonets, men who counted ammunition and rationed grenades and sent wounded to the rear, they did not see a doctrine. They saw weakness. They saw men who had not yet understood that the correct response to combat was to die beautifully. This was not a minor error. It was the master key that unlocked every other Japanese miscalculation of the war. Consider Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, the staff officer who had planned the brilliantly successful invasion of Malaya and who, by late 1942, was shaping operational thinking for the Guadalcanal campaign. Tsuji was, by any measure, one of the most capable planners in the Japanese army. He had taken Singapore in 70 days against an enemy with numerical superiority. He had a gift for terrain. He had a gift for logistics. And he had a conviction, documented in his own writings, that Anglo-Saxon civilization was a civilization of merchants. Utilitarian, individualistic, incapable of collective sacrifice. A civilization that could be broken with a single hard strike. Tsuji was not a fool. He was an ideologue. And his ideology told him that the American Marine on Guadalcanal, equipped with all the advantages of mechanized warfare, was still only a shopkeeper in uniform. A shopkeeper would not endure what a samurai would endure. A shopkeeper would run. The shopkeepers did not run.
The Ichiki detachment was destroyed on the Tenaru. A second force, the Kawaguchi Brigade, was thrown against the Marine lines on a ridge called Edson's a month later and destroyed in the same way. Frontal assault, machine guns, artillery, dawn revealing a field of Japanese dead. A third force, the entire 2nd Infantry Division, was committed in October and destroyed against the Matanakau. Each destruction produced the same lesson. Each destruction was filed under the same heading in Tokyo. Unfortunate tactical error. Not doctrinal collapse. Tactical error. We can do better next time. The inter-service structure of the Japanese military made this self-correction almost impossible. Post-war interrogators from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey discovered, in 1945 and 1946, that the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy had fought what amounted to 2 separate wars under the same flag. They had separate intelligence sections. They shared information reluctantly, and sometimes not at all. Naval air casualties were concealed from Army commanders. Army shipping losses were concealed from Navy commanders. Radar development, the single technology that would most have helped Japanese forces against American amphibious operations, was pursued by both services in parallel, in secret, with neither sharing its findings with the other. A Japanese staff officer, interrogated by USSBS analysts in October 1945, made the point bluntly. He said that in the final 2 years of the war, the Supreme Command was making strategic decisions based on fantasies about American losses that the services had reported to each other for reasons of face. Not fraud exactly, something worse than fraud. A collective agreement not to see the thing that was happening. The thing that was happening between the Tenaru in August 1942 and the assault on Peleliu in September 1944 was this. The American shopkeepers had looked at their dead from Guadalcanal and drawn a conclusion. The conclusion was not that the Japanese soldier was unbeatable. The conclusion was that the Japanese soldier could be beaten at a predictable cost if the Marine Rifle Squad was rebuilt from scratch. So the Marine Corps rebuilt the Rifle Squad from scratch. In 1941, a standard Marine Rifle Squad carried 1 Browning automatic rifle. By late 1944, the Marine Rifle Squad had been restructured. 13 men organized into 3 4-man fire teams, each team with its own BAR, each team capable of independent maneuver under its own automatic weapon. A Marine squad in 1944 carried 3 times the sustained firepower of a Marine squad in 1941, and it carried that firepower in a dispersed, mobile formation that could not be usefully bayonet charged because there was no line to charge into. There were only fire teams, each one covering the others, each one able to generate suppressing fire while another team flanked. This was not a minor adjustment. It was the quiet demolition of every assumption Masanobu Tsuji had ever made about Anglo-Saxon merchants. The shopkeepers had studied their mistakes. The samurai had filed theirs under unfortunate tactical error. Only one of those two approaches generates learning, and the war in the Pacific, after 1942, was the long and terrible demonstration of which approach that was. By the summer of 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army had finally stopped trying to push the Marines back into the sea. This was not because they had run out of courage. They had not. It was because they had run out of men to spend on the idea that courage was enough. The new doctrine had a name. The Japanese called it the honeycomb defense. The Americans would later, with grim economy, call it what it was: a subterranean slaughterhouse. The man assigned to demonstrate the new doctrine on the island of Peleliu was Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the 2nd Infantry Regiment of the 14th Infantry Division. Nakagawa was 42 years old. He was not a mystic. He had watched, from a distance, what had happened to Ichiki at the Tenaru, and to the Kawaguchi Brigade at Edson's Ridge, and to the 2nd Infantry Division at the Matanakau. He had drawn the only conclusion a professional could draw. On Peleliu, Nakagawa had roughly 10,900 men, a terrain of uplifted coral ridges and jagged sinkholes called the Umerbrogal, and explicit orders from Tokyo not to defend the beaches. The beaches were a death sentence. Everyone now understood that. American naval gunfire in 1944 could remove an entire coconut grove and everything in it in a single morning. What Nakagawa was told to defend was the interior. Specifically, he was told to bleed the Americans for every yard of coral they took, for as long as he could make them bleed. Because the strategic calculation in Tokyo was no longer about winning islands. It was about making the price of islands so high that the American public would demand a negotiated end. Nakagawa's engineers went to work with drills and explosives and hand tools. They excavated over 500 interconnected caves and tunnels into the hard limestone of the Umerbrogal pocket. They fitted armored sliding steel doors on the larger positions to contain the overpressure of American naval shells. They cut firing slits at angles that made direct hits nearly impossible. They stockpiled water, ammunition, and rice for a siege measured in months, not weeks. And they laid out interlocking fields of fire so that every approach to every cave mouth was covered by machine guns firing from 2 or 3 other cave mouths. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944, the pre-invasion bombardment had been, by any previous measure, crushing. The Navy had fired thousands of rounds of 5-inch and larger shells into the island. Carrier aircraft had dropped hundreds of tons of bombs. The commander of the Marine Landing Force told his men the operation would take 4 days. It took nearly 2.5 months. The reason it took nearly 2.5 months was that Nakagawa had correctly understood something about American doctrine that Colonel Ichiki had not. He had understood that the American method was not naval gunfire. Naval gunfire was only the opening act. The American method was to use naval gunfire to pin the defender, then to use tactical air power to blind him, then to send in rifle squads supported by armor and engineers, whose job was to go into every single cave and kill everyone inside it, one cave at a time, in sequence, for as long as it took. Nakagawa's honeycomb was built to defeat the naval gunfire. It was not built to defeat what came after the naval gunfire, because what came after the naval gunfire was something no Japanese doctrinal text of the 1930s had anticipated: a tactical system that would enter Marine Corps vocabulary under a name that sounds almost domestic until you understand what it describes: corkscrew and blowtorch. Here is the ratio that matters, and it is not a ratio of ships or tanks or factories. It is a ratio of what each side was willing to learn from a dead man. On the Japanese side, Every dead Marine on a beach was interpreted, within the framework of the Senjinkun, as evidence that the doctrine was working and needed only to be applied more fanatically. One dead American produced 1 unit of confirmation. The framework could not generate any other reading because the framework did not permit the idea that American persistence was itself a form of discipline rather than a symptom of having not yet been broken. On the American side, every dead Marine on a beach was interpreted as data. One dead Marine produced 1 question. What in our current doctrine allowed this death? And what specific piece of equipment, training, or tactical organization would have prevented it? That question was asked at the squad level, at the battalion level, at the division level, and inside the research laboratories at Aberdeen and Quantico and Camp Pendleton. It was asked on the day of the death. It was asked again a week later. And the answers, when they came, were pushed back down into the training pipeline for the next batch of replacements. 1 dead man, 2 interpretations. Multiply it by 3 years. Multiply it by 100,000 dead men. The gap between those 2 interpretations is the reason the Umerbrogel pocket fell. It is also the reason Japanese veterans, when they were finally allowed to speak freely after the war, did not describe the U.S. Marine as a soldier. They described him as something else, something that had not been in the doctrine manuals at all. September 26, 1944, roughly 1,400 hours. A position on Peleliu the Marines called the Point, where the 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines had been trying, for 11 days, to take a Japanese fortified casemate set into the coral ridge. The air smells like white phosphorus and burning coconut palms, and something underneath both of those. A sweetness that everyone on the island has stopped commenting on because there is nothing useful to say about it. The coral is hot enough, in the direct sun, to blister a bare hand laid flat on it. The Marines are not laying bare hands flat on it. They are moving in 4-man fire teams, and one of those fire teams is about to demonstrate to the defenders of the casemate what the Senjinkun did not prepare anyone to be demonstrated. The team leader is a corporal whose name has not survived in the official record. The unit after-action reports reference him only as the BAR gunner of the lead team. Behind him are a rifleman with an M1 Garand, an assistant gunner carrying belts for a heavier weapon in reserve, and a private first class carrying 70 pounds of M2 portable flamethrower on his back. The flamethrower is the reason the team exists in this configuration. Everything else in the formation is there to get the flamethrower within 30 yards of the casemate's firing slit. The corporal opens with the BAR, short bursts aimed at the slit. The rifleman begins placing white phosphorus grenades in front of the opening, and the wind, mercifully, is blowing toward the casemate. Inside the position, 2 Japanese machine gunners who have been firing for 3 days at every Marine movement in the ravine below them cannot see and cannot breathe. They duck below the slit. They have done this before. They have done this dozens of times. They know that if they stay down for 90 seconds, the American fire will lift and they will come back up and go back to work. The American fire does not lift. The private first class with the flamethrower takes 4 running steps and stops 20 yards from the slit. He braces. He opens the valve. What comes out of the M2 is not a stream of fire in the way civilians understand fire. It is pressurized jellied gasoline, thrown in a long tongue that arcs and lands and spreads across a surface and sticks there while it burns. The tongue enters the firing slit of the casemate in a continuous line for roughly 8 seconds. It does 2 things simultaneously. It ignites everything flammable inside the enclosed space: uniforms, ammunition belts, wooden ammunition crates, the men themselves. And it consumes the oxygen in the enclosed space in something closer to an instant than a process. Inside the casemate, the 2 Japanese machine gunners and the 3 riflemen stationed with them experience, in rapid sequence, a flash of heat, a roar they cannot localize, the failure of their own lungs, and then nothing. Outside the casemate, the private first class closes the valve and steps back. The corporal signals the next fire team forward. They are already moving toward the next cave. There is a moment in every account of Peleliu written by Japanese survivors who managed to live through September of 1944 and be taken prisoner in the final days of the battle, when the language stops being the language of doctrine. They had been told by the Senjinkun, by Masanobu Tsuji, by every officer they had ever trained under, that the Americans were soft, that the Americans would not come for them into the caves, that the caves themselves were the solution. But the Americans came for them into the caves. This is the sentence underneath every post-war Japanese memoir of the Pacific. Not the statistics, not the tonnage, not the ratios. The simple, impossible fact that the shopkeepers walked into the honeycomb with flamethrowers on their backs and did not stop walking. Kuribayashi, in 1931, had tried to warn them that the American worker was energetic and versatile. The worker on the end of that flamethrower, 20 yards from the casemate at the point, was precisely what Kuribayashi had meant.
Colonel Kunio Nakagawa held out in the Umabrogal Pocket until November 24, 1944. On that date, with his command reduced to roughly 50 men and his ammunition gone, he burned his regimental colors, apologized in writing to his superiors for failing to inflict sufficient casualties, and took his own life. His honeycomb had succeeded in killing or wounding approximately 9,800 Americans. It had not succeeded in changing anything. The real audit of the Pacific War began in September 1945, when teams from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey set up offices in the Meiji Building in Tokyo and began interrogating the surviving Japanese commanders. The interrogations are worth reading in their original transcripts. They are not propaganda. They are the sound of men who had spent 4 years inside a doctrinal box, finally being allowed to describe the outside of the box. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, the man who had taken Singapore, told the USSBS interrogators about his last months in the Philippines, where American air-ground coordination had made any Japanese movement in daylight impossible. He used a specific phrase. He described his feeling in those months as one of complete helplessness when confronted with this type of opposition. Not defeat, helplessness. The word of a professional soldier admitting that the tools he had been given could not address the problem he had been handed. Another interrogation record from a senior naval officer whose name is logged as NAV number 55 contains the cleanest summary of the war that any Japanese officer ever produced. He told his interrogators that Japanese military forces had many weak points, but that American force had no weak point. He concluded the sentence with 5 words that should have been carved into the entrance of the Imperial War College in 1931 and were not. War against America is not good. The Senjinkun had been quietly withdrawn from circulation by then. No one needed to be told not to surrender anymore. There was no one left to surrender to, and nothing left to surrender with. And the framework that had forbidden it for 4 years had collapsed into a set of interrogation transcripts and a burned regimental flag in a cave on Peleliu. The shopkeepers were already on the ships, going home. Today, the caves of the Umabrogal Pocket are still there. The Pacific climate has not been kind to the armored steel doors, but the tunnels run as deep as they ran in 1944. And if you go down into them with a flashlight, you can still find Japanese ammunition boxes with the stenciling legible and coral walls scorched black in the exact shape of an M2 flamethrower's tongue. Peleliu is today part of the Republic of Palau. It is an independent country of about 18,000 people. Its currency is the United States dollar. Its defense is guaranteed by treaty by the United States of America. Its Coast Guard patrol boats were donated by the United States Coast Guard. Its airstrip, built by Japanese engineers in 1944 and captured by Marines at a cost that still has not fully been counted, is today maintained under an agreement with the United States Department of the Interior. The honeycomb is still there. It has simply been absorbed, which was always, in the end, the point.